Hi everyone. So we just were in our first lecture. We finished talking about endocrine gland stimuli, and what we spoke about was hormonal stimuli. Okay, so the first kind of stimuli that we spoke about, like one hormone influencing the release of another hormone, then another hormone. So three sets of hormone we discussed. So the second type of endocrine stimuli is called not hormonal. Notice the spelling humoral stimuli. Okay, what is this humoral stimuli? It's basically it is synthesized, and this kind of stimuli happens when there is some form of change in, suppose, a drop in a blood iron level, or some sort of chemical change have happened actually. So maybe like some iron has dropped in its required concentration or something like that, that will stimulate the production of an hormone. We have learned about how calcium is regulated by this. So declining calcium actually stimulates the release of a hormone by parathyroid hormone, and this is called as PTH. If you remember, we did talk about this. Parathyroid hormone is actually released from the parathyroid gland. Again, where is this gland located? It is located in our neck. So it secretes PTH, and PTH will, what it will do, it will cause calcium concentration to rise, and until it is calcium has reached the adequate level, this will continue. Okay, until the stimulus is removed, and the stimulus is basically the low concentration level. Till then this will continue. So a particular type of chemical, which is calcium, that is low in our body, which is an ion, that is causing this effect to trigger. So this kind of stimuli is called as humoral stimuli. The third and the final type is actually the neural stimuli. Here, there is no via media case, or there. What happens if we need, then the nerve fibers actually directly stimulate the hormone release. For example, sympathetic nervous system fibers, they actually directly can influence the adrenal medulla to create some hormones like epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine, all of these. And then once these are released, like you can see, these are the hormones, they are directly released into, they directly go into the blood, so they directly become the part of our blood system. So the effect is quite direct in this case, right? And of course, the nervous system is can make adjustments to hormone whenever it's required. For example, if we are under severe stress, then the hypothalamus and the sympathetic nervous system will actually create these hormones, because we need these epinephrine, norepinephrine, dopamine when we are stressed. But at the same time, it can also make certain adjustments. For example, it can actually override the insulin production, and it will that will allow more glucose to stay in our blood. Why? Because the job of insulin is to cut down glucose, right? And when we are stressed, we need more glucose, because glucose is a source of our energy. So therefore, the nervous system will actually cut down the insulin's function at this point. So this will prepare our body for a fight response. If you remember, which nervous system is this? It is actually the sympathetic nervous system. So therefore, in this case, the sympathetic nerve fibers are actually directly working. So this is the third type of endocrine gland stimuli. So quickly, three ways endocrine gland can be stimulated: hormonal, humoral, and then third one is neural stimuli. So the next we'll talk about target cell. So any hormone will have a target cell, so we'll talk about that, and the kind of interaction that might happen between the hormone and then the target cell. So target cells, of course, will have a specific receptor. For example, suppose ACTH is a hormone, will only have receptor on the adrenal cortex. So it will have its own receptor where ACTH will come and bind. This ACTH receptors will only be on this adrenal gland, on the adrenal cortex. It is not going to be on stomach, it is not going to be on lungs, not anywhere else, like we just spoke about. This is very specific. So adrenal ACTH will have its hormone definitely on the adrenal cortex, but not anywhere else, right? It will have the specific receptor on this particular organ, and this is true for every other hormone. Now, but target cell, whether it will be activated or not, that will depend on what is the level of hormone. Is it too low or too high? Depending on that. And then how many receptors are there? Are there adequate number of receptors there to like trigger the response? Or what is the, like, how much is the strength between the receptor and hormone binding? So is it strong enough to create the hormone? So these are the factors that will influence basically the target cell activation. If there is required amount of hormone, if the the number of receptors are enough, and if the strength or this bonding between the hormone and the receptor is strong enough, then only the effect will be created. Now, in certain cases, there could be upregulation or downregulation of target cells, which means target cells can form more receptors if required, if and especially if we have low hormone level, or it can lose receptor if we have really high number of hormones. So this is a kind of a regulation that in target cells that can happen. Now, how are hormones secreted? We just discussed that steroid and thyroid hormones are secreted. So, steroid and thyroid hormones, they don't actually circulate through the blood on their own. They are attached to certain type of proteins called as plasma proteins. They cannot circulate on their own. But other hormones, the amino acid type of hormones, they can circulate pretty freely. They don't need any carriers. So these guys, these plasma proteins, these are the carriers of the steroid and thyroid hormones. Now, concentration of the circulating hormone actually reflects the rate of release and the speed at which it is inactivated and removed by the removed from the body. So if it's too much removed, then obviously the concentration of hormone, of the circulating hormone, is going to be more. Now, how are hormone like removed from our body? Firstly, obviously there are enzymes that can degrade them. Kidneys or livers, these are a type of an excretory organ. So by the help of excretion, they can also remove hormones from our blood. There's a term called half-life of hormone. What is that? This is the time required for a hormone level in blood levels that is decreased by half. Now, this can vary from depending on the hormone to hormone, and this can be just a minute or can be a week. Certain hormones, for example, digestive hormones, can take time to reduce in half level in a couple of hours. But in certain type of hormones, the effect can last for weeks. For example, certain reproductive hormone their effect can last for weeks, so their half life will be longer. Hormones have different response times. It's pretty much the same thing as the half life, and some are inactive until they actually enter the target cell. For example, the steroid hormones, of course, they don't work until they enter inside the cell. So if we directly this is a pretty important chart. If we directly compare between the lipid and the water soluble hormone, then the lipid lipid soluble hormones are the steroid and the thyroid hormones, and water soluble are the amino acid based hormones. What are the sources of steroid hormones? Adrenal cortex, gonads, thyroid gland, of course. Thyroid hormones coming from thyroid glands. Everything else is amino acid. Are lipid hormones stored in secretory vesicles? No, but water soluble hormones can be. How these are transported? We just discussed the lipid soluble hormones are bound to the plasma protein, which are their carriers, and water soluble hormone does not have any carrier. They actually travel freely. Half-life typically in lipid soluble hormones are generally long. Like for example, the reproductive hormones, they have longer half-life. Water soluble hormones are typically short half-life they have, and they can be easily removed by kidney or liver. Receptors, we discussed this in the previous lecture. So these receptors of lipid soluble hormones are inside the cell, and the hormone and the receptor, they bind to form a complex. If you remember, like here we discussed that how the receptors are inside, the hormones travel inside and they form a complex and they directly affect the gene. So therefore so receptors are usually inside for lipid soluble, but for water soluble hormones, the receptors are not inside. They are very much outside. They can't even enter the cell. And mechanism of action of target cells, these can directly activate the genes because they do enter into the nucleus, but here they act with second messenger system. For example, CAMP we discussed, calcium, CGMP, IP3, all these are second messenger system. They have specific receptors, and then they activate. These hormones have the specific receptor that is on the plasma membrane, and when they bind on the receptor, that activates the second messenger system. All right. Now, interaction of hormones at target cells. So, three ways this interaction can happen. Firstly, permissiveness, as the term is telling you, means there is a permission to do something. What is it? So, reproductive hormone need thyroid hormone to have an effect. In order for it cannot exert the cannot reproductive hormones actually cannot create its effect properly if we do not have enough thyroid, if that makes sense. So one have to be present substantially in order to the other ones to work. Synergism, for example, glucagon and epinephrine both can act on liver to release glucose. So they act kind of together. They can do the same thing actually. Okay. And this can also cause amplification, because if both are working together, then it can produce too much of glucose. Antagonism, exactly the opposite way. So this actually one or more hormone, their action is completely different. For example, insulin will cut down our glucose level, glucagon will increase our glucose level. So these are the different ways hormones can act on target cell, and depending on what they're trying to do, they will create the effect, right? For example, if the hormone is trying to the job is to cut down cut down glucose, then insulin will actually do that, and if its job is to release more glucose, then glucagon will do that. So depending on what is our body requires, the hormone will act accordingly on the target cell. Now the next thing we'll talk about actually hypothalamus and pituitary gland. Okay, so hypothalamus and pituitary gland, they work together. There are two lobes of this pituitary gland, anterior and posterior, and they work a little bit differently. So we will first talk about the posterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary only creates two hormones. We'll talk about them, but anterior pituitary are they create a whole bunch of range of hormones. So in this second segment, we will only talk about the posterior pituitary. We'll talk about anterior pituitary in the next part. So therefore, hypothalamus is a part of our brain that is connected to pituitary gland. Pituitary glands is also called as hypophysis by a stalk called infundibulum. So hypothalamus, okay, it is which is in brain. Now here is our infundibulum that is connecting the hypothalamus. This is the infundibulum. Infundibulum is just the stalk, is connecting to the pituitary gland. Okay. And pituitary is divided into two. One is anterior pituitary, one is posterior pituitary. Pituitary secretes at least 8 hormones, and 2 of them actually coming from posterior, rest of it is coming from anterior. So quickly let's see this picture. So here, this is the hypothalamus, okay? This is the pituitary gland itself. So hypothalamus connected with this connecting stalk to the pituitary gland. Now here is our anterior pituitary, here is our posterior pituitary. Okay, so posterior pituitary actually is composed of neural tissues, and it only creates 2 hormones which are neurohormones. Therefore posterior pituitary is also called as neurohyposis, because it creates this hyposis, which is this particular pituitary gland only creates neural hormone. Therefore it is neurohypophysis. Okay, on the other hand, anterior pituitary doesn't do that. It creates its first part, so anterior part, adenohypophysis. Okay, this have the glandular tissue, so this has the major range of function. Okay, so this is the overall how it works. So this is the posterior gland. So this is our hypothalamus. These are the bunch of hormones that the hypothalamus actually secretes directly, and these hormones actually affects the anterior pituitary, and then anterior pituitary. So these are our set 1 hormones. Okay, set number 1 created by hypothalamus. This affects the anterior pituitary. So these are starting from ACH to LH. These are our number set 2 hormones. Now, this guys, this is the hormone we just learned about them in the hormonal stimuli. These hormones now travel through the blood and then affect the target organs, and then they create separate set of hormones, which is the set number 3. These are the ones that are the final set of hormones. Now, as opposed to that, in posterior pituitary, hormones are directly released. So hypothalamus here doesn't create any hormone. Directly it creates, with the help of posterior pituitary, ADH and oxytocin, and that is released directly into the blood, thus affects the target organ. So now we will only talk about the posterior pituitary and how it functions. Remember, this is the neurohypophysis, neural hormones. So they have something to do with the nervous system. So what happens here, the hypothalamic neurons synthesize ADH or oxytocin. These are the two hormones that only can be secreted from posterior pituitary. So they directly create these hormones. And now it travels through this stalk, okay, and through this infundibulum stalk, and then travels into the posterior pituitary lobe, right? Now here they are stored, and when we need them, now these will be released with the help of action potential. When associated hypothalamic neurons fire, then there will be some action potentials, and that will release either ADH or oxytocin directly into the blood. It will directly go into the capillaries. So they are stored in the posterior pituitary. When required, then they are released with the help of action potential. So we are taking help of the nervous system itself. Therefore, these are the neurohypophysis. Now, the type of neurons that ADH or oxytocin is releasing or using is different. So, for example, posterior pituitary, like I said, consists of axon terminals. Oxytocin actually is produced by paraventricular neurons, and ADH is produced by supraoptic neurons. You should know these names. And both these hormones are composed, these are amino acid type of hormones, so they are composed of 9 amino acids. They're almost very similar in their biochemical structure, little bit different by 2 amino acids. All right, so in terms of their function, how are they different? They are different in case of if there is a strong, for example, oxytocin, if there is a strong stimulant of uterine contraction, then oxytocin is released. Similarly, it is a trigger for milk ejection. Okay, so if you remember this, we did study about oxytocin in 208, and this is a positive feedback system. Why? Because once this oxytocin starts releasing, then it will be released until the job is done. So uterine contraction means when a woman is in labor. So means that whenever a woman is labored, then their body will start producing oxytocin, and until the labor is over, then oxytocin will be released. So after that, then it will cut back. So this oxytocin also acts as a neurotransmitter in the brain, and it uses PIP2 second messenger system. So it's an amino acid type of hormone, right? It's not a steroid hormone. The second one is ADH. It also contains osmoreceptors that monitor the solute concentration. If concentration is too high, then posterior pituitary will trigger to secrete ADH, okay, and targets the kidney tubule to absorb more and more water, either water to inhibit or prevent urine formation. So as a whole, this actually monitors our solute concentration, to sum up, and then that means it is actually controlling our urine production, right? So either it will help in urine production or it will actually prevent urine production. So high concentration will cause vasoconstriction, all right, and that's why this is also called as vasopressin. So this actually controls our urine production. Now there's some homeostatic imbalance can happen. For example, diabetes insipidus. This means that we have ADH deficiency in this case, and this means that ADH will not be able to not be able to regulate the water, presence of water in our body, or the presence of solute in our body. Therefore, we will have to keep ourselves hydrated. Otherwise, urine production will be less. All right. Syndrome or SIADH means a retention of fluid, headache, or too much fluid being being retained, and this actually requires sodium level monitoring as well. All right. So the next actually is the anterior pituitary. So anterior pituitary, which I just gave you a introduction, but this actually does not work the same way as the neurohypophysis or the posterior pituitary works. There are three sets of hormones that will work here. A little bit complicated, so we will talk about this in our third part of our lecture. Actually, we might have 4 parts of this chapter. All right, so we'll talk to you in the third part.